But yeah, so thank you guys so much for being here. Like I said, this is yeah, really exciting for me to be able to talk about Egyptian astrology with you guys tonight. This is something I'm like super pumped about, and yeah, I've just been really excited to talk about and discover and talk about with a lot of you guys. So yeah, let's just dive right into it. The first thing I want to just do really quick is also let you guys know I have two other little webinar things coming up. So Saturday, February 3rd, I'm going to be doing like a workshop on astronomical principles in astronomy. So this is really important for every astrologer, should God forbid technology ever fail, these are things that we should know. And I think they're also just important things that maybe not everyone's aware of. So it really helps you to become just a sharper astrologer. It helps to make a deeper energetic connection to your awareness of the sky. And of course, it's crucial for hand calculating charts and understanding things like primary directions if you want to learn more about that. So yeah, we'll talk about all the great circles and how they intersect and interact with each other and all that kind of cool stuff. And then the following Sunday, I'm going to be doing a kind of sequel to this presentation, but it's going to be just focusing on the decans, the 36 decans as they were presented and transmitted and evolved through Egyptian history. We're going to be talking about the names, the mythologies associated with certain decan gods. We're going to talk about the connected asterisms and divine powers, and we'll trace these names through the Greco-Roman period and talk about certain Hermetic doctrines from Nekepsu and Pedosiris on the Decans in practical astrology. So if you're interested and tonight piqued your interest at all, I would definitely recommend or yeah, encourage you to look on my website for more information about that if you want to dive further into that. So with that, the scope of our journey tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about the legacy and history of Egypt, and then we're going to talk about the prehistoric Egyptian astronomy, which actually is pretty significant to our journey and story tonight. Then we're going to kind of go through the sequence of Egyptian history as the astrology developed in those periods. So we'll start with the Old Kingdom, move to the Middle Kingdom, then to the New Kingdom, and then we'll get to the really beefy part, which is the late period and Ptolemaic period in Egypt, where there was, of course, as so many of you know, I'm sure, this amazing blossoming of so many different traditions of astrological practice meeting in Egypt. So that's about where we're headed. So at first, I just wanted to kind of talk about the legacy of Egypt. And this is really important because, for this very reason, we're all gathered here tonight. This mystical, captivating uh, energy surrounding the history of Egypt has been so fascinating to people all over the world for thousands of years. And Egypt has held such a major legacy in this sense. And that's because of the powerful mythological, religious, astronomical, megalithical traditions that they built up and set as an example for the rest of the world to follow upon. And I also really want to emphasize, and this is really important because it's so hard to talk about, we're going to talk about a big period of Egyptian history tonight, which is very challenging, a very challenging thing to do because um, Egypt isn't a monolith. It never was, and it's easy, I think, for us to want to project some idealized vision of it having been this one great kingdom or system or set of practices that were like in one place at a certain time. And Egypt is such a multifaceted being that it's going to be we're just going to touch on the surface of a lot of different things tonight, and I want you to keep in mind that across different periods of thousands of years and different areas within Egypt, there were different combinations of deities with local deities. So I don't want you to get really confused or caught up in any of that because that isn't really what's important here. But I do just want to emphasize that we're taking a really big overview at something that was very multifaceted here. Now, of course, along the way, throughout the entire tradition here, the watching of the sky was what kept everything together, which was the central piece of, you know, almost every different facet of Egyptian life. It revolved around, of course, their calendar, their rituals, their beliefs about the afterlife, the astrology. And I am using that word here, not necessarily astronomy, because astrology, what it is, it's meaning making with the sky for our lives on Earth. And if that's not a part of everything they were doing, then I don't know what is. So, of course, astrology is the fundamental piece that brings all of this together here. So we're going to ask ourselves, where does this all start? And I also just wanted to say I tried to use an AI photo image generator for some of the images you guys will see along here. So they're a little fantastical, they're a little imaginary, but I hope that maybe inspires a little bit of, what we can think about and feel when we connect to this ancient history and this ancient information. So where does it all start? So here's a timeline with a bunch of dates that I just put here for any of you guys that are curious. But the most important thing here is that when we're talking about Egyptian chronology, there were three really peak periods in terms of the cohesive organization, the religious syncretisms, and other kind of socioeconomic and political movements that were known as the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. And these were essentially the longest periods. You'll see that things in between or after were usually considerably shorter. They were much less consolidated, much less stable. And so these three periods of the big kingdoms are where basically there was the most amount of richness in terms of the cultural, technological development of Egyptian history. And we're actually going to start by talking about the very, very prehistorical periods of Egypt that predate um, written history. So we're going to go into the sands of prehistory here, and we're going to start at Nabta Playa, which is a region of the desert within southern Egypt. And this was essentially originally explored by an archaeologist named Wendorf, who discovered these ancient megalithic structures, which this is actually known as the first astronomically aligned megalithic monument in the world. And that's recognized by modern archaeologists. But what isn't so well recognized is actually just how early these monuments may be actually dated. And there's been a really amazing work done by several scholars, archaeoastronomers, people very interested in tracking um, the technological remains of the ancient prehistoric African people from whom we don't have a written history. And essentially, there's an amazing archaeoastronomer. His last name is Brophy. He wrote a book called The Origin Map, which I suggest all of you to read. And this essentially is a diagrammatic scheme from his work where he's basically conjecturing and very succinctly proving that this ancient Neolithic culture, which we're going to say dates anywhere from about 11,000 BC to 7 to 6,000 BC, lived and occupied this area of very southern Egypt, that they also passed down to their ancestors a very specific and intricate knowledge of precession, which is the 26,000 year cycle of the Earth's axis wobbling through the circle of zodiacal images, and that this information was passed down from even earlier peoples. And I also will recommend to everyone here the book Hamlet's Mill, which is really just an astounding work that's gone to show how this ancient knowledge of precession is something that's been transmitted by cultures across the world through mythology and different forms of cultural symbolism. And we're seeing that here because what he's done is actually proven that through several different factors of the alignments of the stone megaliths down here in Nabta Playa are showing that they were tracking actually the orientation of Orion's belt as it hit the midheaven or the meridian of the local space. Um, like I said, around these times of from a range of 11 to 7,000 BC. And what gets even crazier, and I couldn't believe this until I actually really sat and read through his work, which again hasn't been published in mainstream academia, even though he is a peer-reviewed and published author. When he discovered all of this, it wasn't brought or found with so much interest from other academic scholars because what he's actually discovered, and this is really mind-blowing, is that there's a central point that radiates out within this circle here. And he's discovered that from the central point of the megalithic structures, the stones that correspond to the certain stars that he's discovered are actually placed proportionately as far from the center as their astrophysical distances are from Earth and from our solar system, which is really incredible because that's showing that this culture not only passed down a technology of precession, but they were also precisely measuring the amount of distance between our Earth and other stars that scientists just in the last 100 to 50 years have been able to measure with telescopes and modern technology. So they were not only measuring the astrophysical distances of these stars, he also proved they were measuring the velocities, and they measured where the galactic center was, along with making these sculptural galactic maps, which actually show where the patterns of our local space is in our local galactic cluster. So for people asking, the name is the Origin Map by Dr. Brophy. And so yes, this is this, and I just wanted to open with this because I just want us to like all sit here and say like, wow, you know, we can do our research. There's been an ongoing tradition of Egyptology intensely for the last, 250 years or so. But we are very far from having a really clear record of what our ancient ancestors knew about the sky. So I wanted to open with this for that reason and putting us in the context of like, wow, like this, we just can kind of be here in amazement with what we're learning, but there's really still so many mysteries surrounding this ancient tradition here. So moving along, that's gonna cap off our prehistoric Egyptian discussion. And again, this is just more information I'm leaving again for anyone curious, but it will come up a few times when I mention these names in terms of the development of the Egyptian language. Again, not super important, but basically we have Old, Middle, and New Egyptian, which was the basically the proper language of the Egyptians from the Old Kingdom onwards that are normally modernly recognized or heard or understood as hieroglyphs. There was also development into Hieratic, which is a priestly textual version of the language that's kind of in cursive, which became around 660 BC known as Demotic. So this was another evolution of the language that was reformulated, respoken, and the script was also extremely evolved from the hieroglyphic figures, which are very easy to identify. And then the latest stage of the development of the language was Coptic, which uses actually the Greek script, and this came about somewhere between 200 and 300 AD. So if you hear me mention, we'll mostly be talking about the Demotic language once we get to the latter end of the slides, since this was, again, the priestly language that was happening around the late period where we had the rise of the early strata of Hellenistic astrology. And the sources of these texts we'll look at also follow a thread. And we'll go through these as we get into the chronology, but I'm just giving a brief scope here. So there are these different series of books that we're getting this information from. So in terms of these books of transfiguration or the afterlife texts, or the books that were centered around essentially the rituals and practices that aided and assisted the deceased to move on into their next incarnation. These began as the pyramid texts for the pharaohs in the Old Kingdom that evolved into the coffin texts in the Middle Kingdom, and then in the New Kingdom became very much standardized and widespread as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which is also known as maybe the Book of the Dead. Many of you may have heard of that. And then there was also a development or an addition to these transfiguration books in the Greco-Roman period, which were called the books of breathing. And these were about aiding the deceased to breathe in the afterlife, which we'll discuss when we talk about their beliefs as to what these things were all about and why it connects to astrology. There were also the books of the Netherworld, so the Amduat, the Book of Gates and Caverns, and the Book of the Earth. And yeah, we'll talk about these once we get to the Middle Kingdom. And then lastly, we have the books of the sky, the Book of Nut, which is incredibly important. We'll talk about that. It essentially outlines the early forms of the Decans, the hourly developments of their calendar system, and other astronomical concepts. There was also the Book of Day, the Book of Night, and later on in the Ptolemaic period, the Book of Hours, which was a another temple text that basically gave prayers and rituals to be said at the turning of hours throughout the day. Now, we're going to start a little bit with just some cosmological context because we can't just dive necessarily into these into their beliefs and traditions without understanding where they were coming from and what their framework for understanding astrology was. And this is going to bring me back to this whole point about Egypt wasn't a monolith, because when we look at the cosmological traditions, they varied greatly across Egypt from city to city, from cult center to other cult center. Um, so I'm going to offer a few different brief perspectives here, and we'll continue along. So we're just going to build this picture up of kind of how they looked at the universe in a spiritual or mythological sense. So it sort of begins with Nun here. And Nun is seen as a primordial god of the waters. So before all existed, there was Nun. There was just this vast expanse of watery formlessness in the sky. And out of this watery formlessness, and in the left image here, this is the depiction of Nut here. I'm sorry, Nun. Out of this watery formlessness, Atum created himself. And this Atum is also known as Re or Ra. So this is really the essence of their view of a demiurgic creator god. And so it's said that he created the universe, he created his own being with his own Heka, or his own magical power. So we'll talk about Heka again in a little bit, but in this way, him forming himself with his own power out of this oneness or nothinglessness, he formed his own being, and thus the entire cosmos became permeated with this creative Heka force of the sun, or of Ra or Atum. And so, as I mentioned here, he also became co-identified as Re or Ra, a very, of course, solar deity. Now, Atum here, our central dude who kind of put the universe into motion, became the central piece of the Heliopolitan Ennead. So again, Heliopolis was one cult center. Of course, Helios, maybe you recognize that word as the Greek name for the sun. So that is referencing their central belief around Ra or Atum as the demiurgic creator god. And the Ennead is also a Greek term which references the number 9, because this was a group of 9 gods that they collectively worshipped in Heliopolis. And so I've included a small family tree here to show you how they conceptualized this emergence from Atum. He then gave birth to Shu and Tefnut, and their children were Geb and Nut, and they also conceived of 4 more children. Some of these deities we will continue to discuss as we go along. So this was one picture of the cosmology of the Egyptians, which again isn't just this one isolated thing that existed universally. So we also have the Hermopolitan Ogdoad. So Ogdo is again, this is a Greek term referencing the number 8. And this is, even though it's called Hermopolitan and there's all this hype about it in Hermopolis, which was the cult city of Thoth, who was the scribal god of magic and wisdom and writing. There's actually some debate about whether or not this Ogdoad was actually central to Hermopolis. it's kind of nor here nor there, but essentially this is a similar idea as the Ennead, but with it's a group of 8 gods, and this was centered around the origin of the universe.
Oh
They were
yeah,
all
maybe I'm not gonna see him after you. Like,
okay. So yes,
yeah,
and
I'm
to
still on my way. I'm,
okay. Sorry, guys. Just okay. I think that's done. Um, so sorry about that. Yes, the Ogdoad here, which again was central to Toth. Now, again, this is just another perspective, and we'll kind of keep reintegrating this as we get further along. So the role of Ra as the sun god and the cosmic navigator, he established the cyclical order of the cosmos. Okay, so as we all know, our wonderful sun to be our kind of immortal thread that brings us from day to day, he vivified consciousness and energized it towards immortality. So they worship the sun because of course, it is the source of life, but also it became the symbol for the achievement of the immortal life in um, the afterlife. Um, Now, Nut and Geb, these were additionally children, a part of the Ennead of Heliopolis. And so essentially Nut is our sky goddess. So her body holds up essentially the stars in the sky, and the stars are part of her body. And her terrestrial counterpart and brother Geb, he was the earth god upon which we are all standing. And then there was also Shu, who was their father, who was the god of air that supported Nut and held her up while he stood upon Geb. And so these are 2 other figures that we'll revisit. And again, especially Nut, um, as her identity as the stellar firmament became central to the textual transmission of the Decans and these other books of different astronomical and astrological concepts. Now we also have Ma'at playing in a very important role here. Ma'at was another goddess, a part of the ancient Egyptian cultural mindset. It's really even deeper than that. There's not even a word that accurately depicts exactly what Ma'at meant to the ancient Egyptians. But she was the cosmic regulator of justice, okay? So she upheld everything good and orderly about the universe. They believed that because the heavens follow these immortal cycles, because the universe and nature exhibits these perfect cycles, so should we live our own lives in balance and in symmetry with that harmony. And so in the afterlife, the souls and hearts of the dead were weighed against the feather of Ma'at on the scales. And, they were essentially deemed worthy of having lived a morally just life if the weight of one's own soul and the weight of one's own heart was found to be in balance with Ma'at, like I said, who represents that cosmic balance. And this whole process of becoming justified or becoming seen by Toth, who was writing down the results of each measurement on these scales. This justification process was the central, a central step, essentially, in this larger transfiguration process of the afterlife beliefs for the Egyptians. Now, the importance of the solar worship was so crucial because the sun, in regulating our natural cycles, upholds that cosmic balance that Ma'at represents. So the sun, in this way, also regulates the natural rhythms of our own lives. So worshiping the sun was helping to obtain Ma'at for everyone. So this regulated the life and activities of the Egyptian people to maintain Ma'at, to maintain peace. Now, I also mentioned earlier this term Heka, and Heka is both symbolized as a god for the magical force of power, and at the same time was the word for the magic itself. It was really just one thing. Um, the magic was the god, and the god performed the magic, and just doing magic was invoking or becoming the god because that's just how it works. I hope that made sense, but there's really no easy way to like describe this transcendental idea of Heka because That's what it's all about. It's activated through speech. And so that's what you can see in this image here depicting the god Heka pointing to her mouth, because we can see how it is evoked through speech, through the power of the verbal word. This is what the force of magic um, is composed of, through our own consciousness and through our own words. Now, this Heka force um, continued to be the central belief of all facets of Egyptian philosophy, because the way that that consciousness of the god was transferred to the power of the intention of whoever is performing the magic or performing the Heka, so too did the priests of the Egyptian temples invoke that Heka onto their statues. So this is really crucial for understanding the mindset of the ancient Egyptians regarding their statues, because it wasn't just an image of the god, it was the god incarnated into the statue itself. It was a living being. So these statues, being so sacrosanct, were kept within the most sacred parts within the center of the temple, and they weren't for public view necessarily, because of the absolute sanctitude of these statues, which again were seen as the gods themselves. So there were occasional times during festivals where public worship was, this was an option for the citizens of Egypt to actually go out and see when these statues were brought outside of the temple. So people were able to make offerings and connect with or pray or, make any kinds of additional or um, you know, otherwise not normally possible ways to connect with their local deity or the deity of the cult center within this specific city. Now, I also want to talk about the levels of the Egyptian soul, because this is going to be a central part of the kind of thesis here, where the Egyptians did not believe in, again, just having this it's just essentially a very complex way of looking at how all of our levels of being interact with each other. And so I've outlined a few of them here, and this is just kind of a brief overview of looking at how they saw each layer really. But what they would the most important parts of it is that we have the Ket, which is our physical body. This is our gross body. And then there were two pieces that were really central to this, and we're going to touch on this several times, which these two pieces were called the Ka and the Ba. And so the Ka is sometimes called the spiritual double, or it's essentially it's the personality complex of an individual that remains a part of your own being. It's not necessarily the psyche of your mind, but it's sort of like I guess you could say, um, like, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. The Ka essentially works to personify the being that is incarnated based off of what we'll see later as the astrological chart or the positions of the planets. And Iamblichus talks about this, and I have a quote I think we'll see um, later on here, because the Ka becomes the essential part of these transfiguration rituals. Now, the Ba itself is the immortal soul. This is the universal spark of life that everyone has a piece of and that returns to the source creator upon death. Now, an Akh, this is similar to Ankh, and that's also not for no reason. The Akh is essentially a transfigurated soul, which means the Ka and Ba, which upon death are separated, through the process of these afterlife rituals, become reunified and create a new soul called an Akh, which immortalizes that being into the firmament. And this process for the pharaohs entailed the invocation of different stellar constellations. The last piece, which I mentioned here, is the Ren, or the name. And so they had prayers for making sure that the deceased remember their name in the afterlife, because forgetting your name is essentially like losing a part of your soul that is a form of death. And so they believed they wanted to immortalize their names in temples and in tombs, because with the death of your name is essentially another version of the death of your own soul. So they believe that the Ba leaves the body at death, but the Ka, which again is that kind of personality, spiritual complex of the soul, remains and rests for 70 days. And that 70 also ties into the mummification process and how long this period was observed for, that these rituals were performed for. And this connects to actually the heliacal cycles of the stars and the decans, which again, we'll touch on them. I won't have a lot of time to go really deep into the decans tonight, because that's also the focus of the presentation on Sunday, February 11th. But essentially, that is a direct link to this afterlife revivification process here. And so the reunification of the Ba and Ka, like I mentioned, this is the process of transfiguration into an Ak. And so that is the immortal soul that resides among the other stars, with the other deified souls in the field of reeds, or the field of Aru. There's different terms for this sort of like paradise afterlife area where these immortal Aks get to reside for eternity. Now, like I mentioned, that word is very similar to Ankh, which I'm sure many of you have heard or seen this symbol, which is right here. And Ankh literally is Egyptian for the word life. It is the verb to live. It's the noun life itself. And the symbol was seen in art, like I have shown here. You'll see certain deities holding the Ankh, which is showing their immortality, their living being. But also you'll see in this case, it was sometimes showed being held up to the face of someone, or to the face of a deceased person, as if to say they are being reborn through the breath of life. And so the Ankh is an offering of rebirth and initiation into immortality in the afterlife. So now that we've talked about some of these spiritual conceptions of their afterlife beliefs, we're going to start looking at some of these textual pieces from the pyramid text, which is going to help ground our understanding of the astrology that's the backbone and mechanism for how all of this really amazing stuff is going on. So we're going to look at these astronomical concepts within the pyramid texts. And I'm getting these from a variety of publications, with different translations from Seth and Faulkner here. But yeah, these texts are the gateway to the cosmos. And it's also important to keep in mind that for the Old Kingdom, we are essentially about to be looking through the texts that were specifically reserved for the elite, the pharaoh and his family, if they even had tombs, that also preserved these texts. But a central part of these pyramid texts and this afterlife ritual was the very crucial opening of the mouth ritual, or the reanimation ritual. And this was the component of the entire sequence of spells and prayers. And this was essentially the reactivation of the senses of the deceased. So what happens during the opening of the mouth ritual is the Wab priest, essentially using different ceremonial tools that represent different constellations, which we will get to that in just a moment, touches the face of the deceased sarcophagus, and one by one touches the mouth, the nose, the eyes, the ears, so as to reactivate the senses of the deceased, so that their soul may continue to breathe, to see, to speak, to hear in the afterlife, which is crucial for the performance of the tasks that allow them to become justified and allow them to become a reunified Ach. So this is continued from section utterance 407 of the pyramid texts. And this is from Teti's pyramid. It says Teti's mouth has been opened. Teti's nose has been opened. Teti's ears have been unstopped. Teti will decide matters, will judge between two. Teti will command one greater than he. So essentially, this inscription is talking about how his senses have been reactivated, and he is now able to stand in the afterlife as a being that is capable of performing these tasks to succeed in his transfiguration. There's also a quote here from a New Kingdom text, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which was the evolution of these pyramid texts. And this is the chapter from the Papyrus of Ani, which is one of the most well-preserved copies of this Book of Coming Forth by Day. And this is the chapter of the opening of the mouth of Osiris, which was Ani. So Ani was this guy who we have in his from his tomb is this book of spells that was written for him, and they were always re-individually, wrote for whoever this deceased person was. They were personalized. And the reason it says the opening of the mouth of Osiris, comma, the scribe of Ani, as in it's in a positive phrase, they're equating them. That's because the process of doing this deified the dead into becoming identified as Osiris and actually identified them as Orion in the sky. So this is where we're headed, but just we're gonna keep piecing these little pieces together. So this section here from the Book of Coming Forth by Day says, "Be opened my mouth by Ptah, untied the bandages twice, which are upon my mouth by the god of my own town. Come then, Toth, filled with and provided with magic, untie the bandages twice of set which fetter my mouth." And so again, we're getting the description of the spiritual activation of these senses through the ritualistic opening of the mouth ceremony here. Now, another concept in astronomical concept in these pyramid texts were something referred to as the indestructible. So these essentially are the circumpolar stars, which do not rise or nor set. So they remain visible year round, all night long in the northern sky. And so because of the nature of their observation of the sunrise, the sun setting, the other Decanic and any other stars that rose and set, having to go through the journey of rising up to the heights of the sky and going into the depth of the duat or the underworld, these stars were not subject to that life cycle. They remained visible and never died. So they were called the indestructibles because they couldn't be defeated by death. So the goal of the dead was to join these indestructible stars in the heavens, or to join the solar bark of the sun, or to become immortalized with stellar images like Orion or Osiris, which again, there's a few different things here, but that's again, this whole thing of Egypt isn't a monolith because there is variety within these transfiguration texts which describe all of these phenomena or just some of them, and in every sense, they were all a part of this deification process. Now we have an excerpt here from the back to the pyramid text, utterance 432. So this says, the king prays to the sky goddess. O great one who became sky, you are strong, you are mighty. You fill every place with your beauty. The whole earth is beneath you, you possess it. As you enfold earth and all things in your arms, so have you taken this Pepi to you, an indestructible star within you. So this is for the pyramid of Pepi, who was another pharaoh in the early dynasties of the Old Kingdom. And we're getting the sense here again that he's moving to becoming an indestructible circumpolar star. Now, the next important concept in the texts and in these rituals is the central piece of these circumpolar stars, which is, as many of you, I hope you all know, the Big Dipper, right? This is what pretty much every kid first learns to look up in the sky and identify. And, there's very much a reason for that. There's a historical basis of the ritualistic observation and prayer to this stellar image for thousands of years. So this was seen as a part of the bull of heaven. Its name was Meskheti, and it is essentially called the foreleg. Ursa Major was seen as the foreleg of this bull, And it's, again, one of these indestructible images. And the power here, essentially, this northern asterism was another gateway. Okay, this was the central gateway to those deceased souls who were on their way to immortality in the afterlife. Now, what's very fascinating is the offering of this bull's foreleg, aka the symbolic Big Dipper, was used in the rituals, and particularly in the segments or vignettes around the opening of the mouth ritual. And so we have an image right here of this bull's foreleg being cut off. And so in this ritual, they would cut the leg of the bull. And in its moments after being severed from the living cow, its life force was transferred from the body into the severed leg. And just like some animals still twitch when a limb falls off or is cut off, during the last moments of the twitching of this leg, full of all of its life force, of its spiritual life force, it was held up to the mouth of the person undergoing these rituals, and it was therefore brought onto their body to assist in the energetic activation of the opening of their senses, the opening of their spirit to ascend up to these circumpolar stars through these rituals. Now, we also have references, of course, to the goddess Isis and to the god Osiris. So these were two siblings. I'll jump back really quickly so you can see in the original family tree of the Ennead. Okay, so Isis and Osiris were children of Geb and Nut, again, the earth and sky gods. And Osiris became, after ruling as Pharaoh in Egypt, he was killed by his brother Set. Again, there's different versions of this myth. I'm sure many of you, if you're here, have heard of a variation or the general storyline of the Isis and Osiris myth. But his sister wife, Isis, after she found out that Set had killed him, and that he had scattered the parts of Osiris around Egypt. And again, there's actually variant stories of that. In some stories, he was put in a box that became buried in a tree that where a temple was built, and Isis went and worked in this temple to prove her dedication to the pharaoh or king that was kind of the high priest at this temple. And they opened it up and they excavated the body of Osiris back out. So there's different versions of this, but the idea here is that she reanimated Osiris. She recollected these pieces of his dead body, and through her own Heka, and again, there's various ways this happened in the mythological tradition, but the idea here is that Osiris became the first Akh. Okay, he was the first being to be reanimated through the power of the Heka, of the reanimation ritual, of the opening of the mouth. And her image, actually, there's another image which I haven't included here, but when in, for instance, some later temples, in some of the Ptolemaic temples, when there are inscriptions of Orion and Sirius, or Isis and Osiris, what is actually depicted is Orion or Osiris as this man figure and Sirius as a bull. And that's because Isis was identified through this immortalizing power of the bull's foreleg, which we already discussed was Ursa Major. And so their power in their union, that foreleg and Osiris coming together, reanimated him, made him immortal. And again, these were correlated for Isis. She was Sirius, and Osiris was Orion. So his resurrected form identified and became that image of Orion in the heavens. And so what became the canon here, for every pharaoh that died, he needed to transfigure himself into Orion, just as Osiris was the first example to do so. And so that's why in all of these pyramid texts and later texts, it will say, this king, blah, 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 Osiris, as if they're like one thing, because the process is to become reassimilated as Osiris and then transfigured into Orion through the assistance of the Heka force, Isis, the Big Dipper, this foreleg that was held up in the ritual. And so we have an excerpt here where the king prays to the sky goddess, and this is mainly about the color of his skin here. And this green coloration of Osiris's skin is very important because when you read other texts about the goddess Nut, or about the color of the starlight, the Egyptians very interestingly describe the stars as having a greenish color. And so what we read right here is, and I'll just read it straight through. This is utterance 350. The king prays to the sky goddess, O great strider. So this is Nut, who sows greenstone, malachite, turquoise stars. As you are so green, so may Teti be green, green as a living reed. So there's a bunch of threads happening here. One, we have the connection of this green starlight, which is a part of the body of Nut. Then we also have this prayer that Teti, who is the pharaoh who's becoming deified here through his pyramid texts, we're having him become green as the starlight, which is also the same green as Osiris, and green as a living reed, which again is the Osiris's role actually as a fertility god, because the green, lush fields of the fertile soils is the same reproductive life force that is exuding through this green starlight of immortality in the heavens. And so that's what this little utterance is about in invoking his green form. Now, the Ka, which, if you guys remember, rests for 70 days with the deceased body as these rituals are being performed. And to sustain the life force of the Ka, offerings needed to be supplied to it. So this actually is really a very interesting belief, because when we talk about the creation or the, essentially any ritual offering, what happens is like, well, people wonder, it's like, well, why do we put, why do we offer water, or why do we offer, sweets or meals or tobacco or whatever offering to spirits? And that's because food and beverages also contain a ka. They contain a spiritual essence that the ka of other beings can eat or uh, consume or be supplied with. So the importance of the priests and the family making sure that the deceased person had ritual offerings was crucial, because in this way, their ka could be sustained throughout the process. And so in some cases, they would draw or they would put inscriptions or pictures of food on the walls, and they believed even the ka of these images of food could then be used as sustenance for the deceased person should the food or physical food offerings not continue to be made. And so here's another passage. This is from the private tomb of Princess Ni-Sejer-Kai, an early 5th dynasty princess. And this says, may offerings be given on the New Year's feast, the Thoth feast, the first of the year feast, the Wag feast, the Sokar feast, the Great Flame feast, the Brazier feast, the Procession of Min feast, the monthly Sajt feast, the beginning of the month feast, the beginning of the half month feast, every feast, every day, to the royal daughter, the royal ornament, Ni-Sejer-Kai. So this is again showing us that the continual offering of these, whether it was physical or any other kind of offering, these had to be continually made to supply the ka of the spirit, which was still on earth and which could still be transmitted to the super celestial part of the being as well. But it sustained its life force overall. So these offerings had to continually be made. Another astronomical concept in the text is, of course, the horizon. Of course, who's not going to note the horizon, right? We're humans. We're looking around and like, wow, what's up there and down here? But they had some interesting terminology for it. So it was called Akhet. And this is essentially, yeah, the horizon line. But there's also a translation of this term as Lightland, and their conception of the horizon as this distant realm called Lightland. And so its dwellers were called the Aktiu. And these were the lands of the distant horizons, as they were dwelling places for guardians of the firmament that lived on the edge of the universe. So we have another utterance 407 here where the king is going to join the sun god Ra in his solar bark. And this is again from the pyramid of Teti. It says, Teti has purified himself. May he take his pure seat in the sky. Teti endures. May his beautiful seats endure. Teti will take his pure seat in the bow of Re's bark. The sailors who row Re, they shall row Teti. The sailors who convey Re about Lightland, they shall convey Teti about Lightland. So there's this process here, and we have another excerpt here to kind of build this image of this liminal zone around the firmament. And this is a stela from Nihebsed Pepi from Nakata. And it says, this is essentially this description of this guy. Judge, chief scribe, Nihebsed Pepi in his tomb, which is in the good western desert, Lightland. She has taken his hand. He has joined land. He has crossed the firmament. May the western desert give her hands to him in peace before the great God. And so this is again referring to that liminal space here spiritually, that they understood the horizon as this like distant land where to get to the firmament, there were these beings that dwelt there that had to be appeased and prayed to offer ascension into the firmament. Now, speaking of the horizon, there have been really important developments in archaeoastronomy, which is the study of the celestial alignments of these physical structures in remote history, not just Egypt, of course. And there's an Italian astrologer, Giacomo Albano, who has done some amazing research on this. And quick sidebar, the Cayley Institute, which is an astrological library and school run out of Olympia, Washington, is now offering a quarterly journal of which I am the editor-in-chief. And we just recently published the first issue, which is available for free online. I have a blog post on my website where you can go access that first one. We included an issue or an article from him from some work he's published in a book recently about Egyptian archaeoastronomy and certain discoveries made about the alignments of Egyptian temples along the horizon to the rising and setting places of the stars specifically associated to Orion and Sirius and some other important stars. And of course, those alignments were to these rising and setting points of the stars because these were those gateways that allowed this transfiguration process to happen for their kings, for their priests, for the pharaohs, etc. Now, and again, that's because this whole process of their magical worldview of the temple had to replicate the cosmos itself. So every temple itself was a replica of the larger macrocosm. And so the alignment to certain celestial objects reinforced that powerful metaphysical link between worlds. And there's a lot more to say about all the different layers of the temple and what they symbolize in the Egyptian cosmology, like we talked about earlier with Geb and Nun, the primordial waters, etc. I don't have time to talk about all that stuff right now, but like, yeah, there's so many amazing things here. And I hope you guys can understand that at this point, I'm doing my best to kind of put all these ideas together and share how astrology was conceived in their ancient mindset. And it's going to get more interesting. But yeah, there's always more to talk about. Essentially, everything goes so deep with the Egyptians. It's just incredible. Now, again, with these temple and megalithic structural alignments, the pyramids were also, of course, aligned to the stars in several different ways. And I will also, of course, recommend the texts of Boval, who wrote an initial book that became kind of popular. Maybe you've heard of the Orion Mystery. He wrote some subsequent books that developed the theory even more. And Brophy, the guy who did the archaeoastronomy in Nabta Playa, who I mentioned very early on, he also did some insane work on the archaeoastronomy of the Giza Plateau. And yeah, I can't recommend you guys, if you're curious, to look more into those sources. But the pyramid shafts, which, archaeologists are like, well, were they for air? Were they for this or that? They were star shafts that point right to the stars at exactly precise moments. They were not just haphazardly made. The descending passage of the Great Pyramid points right to the North Star as it would have been around the time of the creation of the pyramids. So Thuban back in around, let's say, 3500 BC to 1500, 2000 BC, maybe a little later. Thuban was our old pole star because, of course, this precessional piece of our celestial geometry rotates our northern axis of Earth, which points us to different stars over time. So this one structure in the pyramid was perfectly aligned to Thuban, and the southern shaft was perfectly pointed to Alnitak on Orion's belt. So we see even in the Great Pyramid, the linkage of these two different stellar regions of Orion and of the circumpolar stars, and it's built into their greatest physical monument here. So there's so many pieces to how all of this kind of comes together, and it's really insane to conceptualize on just how many different levels this was incorporated into their monuments, their rituals, etc. And now here's utterance 442 of the pyramid text where the king becomes a star. So it says, your hand is grasped by Re, your head is raised by the two Enneads. Lo, he has become Orion. Lo, Osiris has become Orion. Lord of wine at the Wag feast. Good one, said his mother. Air, said his father. Conceived of sky, born of dusk. Sky conceived you and Orion. Dusk gave birth to you and Orion. Who lives by the god's command, you shall live. You shall rise with Orion in the eastern sky. You shall set with Orion in the western sky. Your third is Sothis, pure of thrones. She is your guide on the sky's good paths in the field of rushes. And so with utterance 442, we have the clear, explicit delineation that the king has now become absorbed into the stellar image of Orion and will perpetually rotate with him in the firmament. And with that, we are transitioning from the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom. And we're going to talk about the coffin texts. So, like I said, the development of these transfiguration texts had this middle period where before the Book of the Dead, or as it really is called, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, was standardized, we had the coffin texts. And that's somewhat restrictive in the sense that these texts, these transfiguration texts, appeared in many different facets of the tomb. So they appeared actually written even on the papyrus cloths of the mummies, or not papyrus, but on the linen cloth. It appeared on the ushabtis, who were these small statue figurines that were basically like these spirits that were invoked to help do work for the deceased so that they could basically deal with any afterlife tasks or things. They could have this little statue do it for them. They were written on those. They were written on stelae. They were written on other things too, but they were also very much on the coffins or the sarcophagi. And the big thing here is that as time progressed, we see that these transfiguration rituals became accessible to more people than just the king, than just the pharaoh. So this is like afterlife for all, I just wrote there, because more people are getting to partake in this process. And what's also I've noted very curious about this transition is that the texts have a stark change from third person singular language, as in he becomes this, she becomes that. It changes to that. The majority of the texts are written in the first person singular, as in I. I do this, I am this, I stand here as this, or whatever. And it's emphasizing the magical, active magical element in the rituals that was performed. And it's also curious to, I guess, just ponder about how that development coincided with the ability of more people to be empowered, knowing they could partake in these rituals, or, there's different lenses you could think about this, but it's an interesting shift that happened at the same time. The other crucial element here is that the Middle Kingdom period, so, okay, we're going to start moving to about 2000 BC. So the Old Kingdom, we'll say, was like 2500 BC to like 2000 BC. Now the Middle Kingdom is 4,000 years ago. beginning around that time. Um, and this is really where we see the emergence of the Decan star clocks on the coffins of the Middle Kingdom. So again, these decans are it's a complex system of there's a calendrical element, there's a ritualistic element, there's a yearly, hourly timing element. So there's a lot of pieces to it that we can't really get into everything tonight. But the basic thing is that they were not only a calendrical, but also a spatial division of the sky. So the decans as a list was a calendar and a map, which is actually very similar to the Babylonian astrolabe, which was also divided into 36 segments, and is also dated to times concurrent and even pre-Egyptian decanic star clocks or diagonal star tables. So that's very interesting to consider. Now, these decans map the year into 36 10-day segments, or equally 36 10-degree segments of the sky. And so this complex system changed over the centuries. It morphed, it had different forms. The decans had multiple names. So there's a lot to this that we won't talk about all of it. But if you want to learn more in like 2 weeks or a little over that on that Sunday 11th, February 11th, we're going to go all into these things. And that's going to be amazing because there's so much to look at here. Now, Sopdet, Isis, Sirius, as we looked at higher up in the slides, her decan is believed to correspond with the first decan of Cancer. Now, using the fixed sidereal zodiac, which is a kind of a whole other discussion, but there's good evidence to show that the first zodiac that was in use in the ancient world was fixed with 15 degrees of Taurus sitting right on Aldebaran. And in any case, using a ecliptical projection, Sirius, her star goes into about the middle decan of Gemini, about 19 degrees. So, you might wonder, well, if it's like an ecliptical thing, they're measuring where Sirius meets the zodiac, why is it in Cancer? Well, that's actually because for the latitudes of Egypt, for all the latitudes of Egypt, when the first decan of Cancer on the ecliptic is rising, that is actually the range where Sirius will rise along the horizon. So even though she actually projects through the ecliptic to the middle of Gemini, she projects through the horizon to the first decan of Cancer. Now, this phenomenon of tracking Sirius, of tracking Isis, of tracking her motherly immortalization, revivification, power, and Heka for the Egyptians was so important because at the annual heliacal rise of this star, so after a period of the sun being close to the star in sidereal Gemini and Cancer, eventually she is separated far enough that on one beautiful morning, she appears in the solar crown after being invisible. And this coincided with a period of essentially a reset for the Egyptians. This event corresponded with the flooding of the Nile River and also was the cornerstone to their agricultural and economical prosperity. Because with the flooding of the Nile, it indicated prosperity. It indicated, enough water to grow their crops, etc. So the flooding of the Nile, like a mother's water, which breaks forth to announce the birth of her child, was symbolized as Isis's overflowing love for humanity to bring prosperity to the people of Egypt. So there's two things going on in the sky, right? There's the annual passage of the season, the annual heliacal effects of the sun moving through the constellations, making new stars appear and disappear. And on a whole other side, there was the thing called the Egyptian civil calendar. And the problem here is that there has been this conflation of these things because of the way certain scholars and people talked about the rise of Sirius coinciding with or resetting or re-beginning the Egyptian calendar. But this is actually a misunderstanding because how the civil calendar worked is it was a fixed 365-day calendar. So without the intercalation, which means accounting for extra time, which our year is 365 and a quarter days. So that's why in our Gregorian calendar, which is very lame, we reset with a leap year every 4 years. They didn't intercalate, which means every year the seasons slowly sifted off from their civil calendar. So that means the seasons, including the rise of Sirius, which is tied with the seasons, moved through the civil months of the year, like Thoth, Mesore, Epiphi, Paufi, like these Egyptian names. Maybe if you've read any Hellenistic astrological texts, they reference the certain times of the year in this Egyptian calendar. And what that means is eventually those do resync up again, eventually. And if we do some quick math in our brain, if it's off a quarter of a day every 4 years, that means it shifts one day every 4 years because the sun moves 1 degree in the sky in one day. So for the sun to shift back 360 degrees, that's 360 degrees times 4 years, which, if you do the math, is a 1,460 year cycle. And this is called the Sothic cycle because what happens is Sothis heliacally rises on the same day of their civil Egyptian calendar. And this alignment happened during the Old Kingdom, and they were such a strong kingdom for so long that they lived to see another alignment 1,460 years later during the New Kingdom, and it realigned a third time during the Roman period, which was a significant cultural thing. I can't really get into that, but this is just very interesting to think about how long the Egyptian people prospered, because this is a huge cycle that they actually got to witness several times. Now, some of these really archaic forms of Egyptian astrology were preserved in later Hellenistic astrologers, namely Hephaestion of Thebes. So there were several astrologers, of course, that we can speculate have transmitted original material from the Egyptian astrologers, namely Nekepsos and Petoceris, their books, which we'll reference in just a bit. But Hephaestio recorded some really important texts, and this gives us some insight into their astrology that was done. And I know we're still talking about the Middle Kingdom. These excerpts are likely from a little bit later, but I'm including them here since we're talking about Sirius's rise. So essentially, these omens that were taken at the heliacal rise of Sirius had different delineations based off of where Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars were found in front of the celestial images, in front of any of the 12, of course, because the sun can be around sidereal Cancer and Leo, and Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn can be anywhere. But naturally, Venus and Mercury are homodrome, or tethered to the sun. And so their omens are only for them being in Gemini, Cancer, Leo, or Virgo. And so each of these things have different indications that they would prognosticate. And interestingly enough, George R. Hughes, in his paper on this Demotic astrological text, conjectured, after even some discussion with Otto Neugebauer, who is one of the seminal researchers in ancient Egyptian astronomy and astrology, that there was a Demotic text from, again, this is a later period kind of thing, that was actually taking notes from Sirius's acronical rise, which is exactly the opposite end of the year, when instead of just rising before sunrise, Sirius rises at sunset. And this was a heliacal phase tracked by the Egyptians and especially by the Babylonians. This was a really important heliacal phase for a fixed star, because that means that it's actually riding through the firmament visible all night long. It's actually conceived as its most powerful phase in certain Babylonian contexts. Now, this is really important for a couple reasons. One of them is, of course, because Sirius, as the brightest star, is basically at her most powerful during her acronical or evening rise, which would happen at this other time of year when the omens were taken. But reason number two it's really important is because I just checked on a software I have that can calculate the heliacal phases of fixed stars, and Sirius is actually making her acronical rise at many latitudes on Earth today, and yesterday, and tomorrow. So I thought that was really incredible, actually. It just happened to notice that while I was doing some of this research here. So that's very interesting. Now we're gonna transition from the Middle Kingdom and actually move to the New Kingdom. So in the New Kingdom, the decanic star clocks got a little bit of a development. And in three royal tombs of around the 11th century BC, we actually see a change from these 36 10-day segments, which we all know as this even division of the 36 decans, to actually 15-day segments. And what that does, like in the math, if you think about that, is with a 10-day period or a 10-degree segment, the ecliptic amount of ecliptic that rises in 10 degrees takes about 40 minutes on average. So by making it actually 15 degrees or 15 days, what we get is actually what it was 2/3 of that at 10 degrees into a full 3/3 of a 60-minute hour. So basically, they shifted from 40-minute segments to 60-minute segments. Um, and Joachim Quack talks about this in his paper, Astronomy in Ancient Egypt, and why this was an important development in the changing of these new system of star clocks that came in. And of course, like I've been hyping up and bringing up this amazing text, the development now in the New Kingdom of the Transfiguration text is the Book of Coming Forth by Day. So this essentially became kind of like mass produced. So what was happening at this time was actually scribes were couldn't keep up making new copies of these papyri enough, and they would leave the spaces blank so that when someone would purchase this, if they had enough money, they could have their own name written into it for their personal funerary rituals. Um, and this also came along with a standardization of the content that we found there. So this was really the it became a lot more systematic. It wasn't as like kind of pick and choose from the things that we see in the earlier texts. It was very linear and followed a pattern that we could see across all of the remaining scripts of the Book of Coming Forth by Day that we have. The New Kingdom also is important for the introduction of the books of the sky, which were namely the Book of Nut, Book of Day, and the Book of Night. And so these are preserved in actually also Demotic in later periods in some papyri. Um, but yeah, the Book of Nut, of course, is crucial because with the Book of Nut, we're getting a detailed explanation of the heliacal phases of the decans, how many days they spend at work when they're able to be used for counting the hours at night, how many days they spend in the underworld. There's other information on the Nut book about certain phases for the planets, phases of the moon, different lunar phases as actually representing different interactions between different deities. There's a lot of interesting things in the notebook. And also in the New Kingdom, there's also these in the same temples or rather tombs of particularly Seti the First in Abydos, who was around the 13th century BC. There are these really interesting texts on the walls that are like right in between the Book of the Day and the Book of Night that are seem to be a really early precursor to the later definitions of Purana Talanta according to the Greek astrologers. And this word has to do with para basically means with, and anatella means to rise. So objects that are along the horizon that are rising with each other, like I talked about earlier, how I was saying that Sirius ecliptically projects into Gemini 2, the middle decan of Gemini, but she's in Purana in Egypt with Cancer 1, or with the first decan of Cancer. So actually, there are some texts in these same tombs that have the notebook and the Book of the Day and Night that talk about stars of the northern sky, stars of the southern sky, stars that rise with the sun and before or after the sun. So there's really interesting parallels here that the same scholar Joachim Quack made in this paper about these early Egyptian precursors to the Purana Talanta. And this was also a lot of really interesting information there about how that actually was developing. Again, this basically making groundwork for later development with that in Hellenistic astrology. But we also have to keep in mind, like I mentioned earlier, that the idea of Purana Talanta was something that existed in Mesopotamia for a long time, namely through the texts like the Mulapin, which was actually about the same time or a little after as these texts in Abydos and Seti's tomb, but also the astrolabe texts of the Babylonians, which are dated to probably much earlier than these, also contain crucial elements of the Purana Talanta, in which image rises north and south of each ecliptical image. We also in the New Kingdom get these books of the Netherworld. So these Book of the Gates, Book of Caverns, the Book of Earth. And this is about the division of the sun's nightly journey under the earth into the Duat um, through these temporal hours. And this is actually where we can imagine that the conception of the houses first came to us from, because the later Demotic manuals of astrology that came about, let's say, anywhere from 300 BC to 0 AD, and even later, those are really the first places we start to hear any talk about the dodecatropos, or the division of the sky into 12 physical sectors that have different topics of life associated with them. In that light, that these house division conceptions came through the Demotic materials, we can really see that this would have came from their conception of these Netherworld books, which describe the movement of the sun through the sectors of the sky above and below the earth. And it's especially interesting in the Book of Caverns, which instead of having these 12 hourly segments, it actually is evenly in 6 segments, which is how we divide up the nocturnal houses of the sun. So with that, we're finally getting into the late periods of Egypt and the Greco-Roman periods. This is especially a exciting time for astrology in Egypt, like I've been mentioning. And yeah, this is essentially where we have this blossoming of all these different traditions that are coming together. And now we're looking at somewhere at the earliest, we'll say like 400 to 500 BC, that continued, especially ramped up around 300 BC with the beginning of the Ptolemaic period in Egypt, the Hellenistic era, and continued somewhat afterwards into the Roman conquest and occupation of Egypt after the current era, or 0 AD. So there were a lot of amazing things that just developed in this period in terms of the life and work and activity and flourishing of astrology in these Egyptian temples that were kind of everywhere. Um, so one really interesting thing is something that this scholar Joachim Kwak has a book and articles about. He has a book on the Book of the Temple, but he references it briefly in this article that he published in 2018. That these temples around this time, because we're getting into the Demotic phase of a lot of the materials here, and that there was essentially this book called the Book of the Temple, and he writes that it was a fundamental Egyptian composition on the ideal temple, its architectural layout, and the duties of the priests. And so it's at this point that there's a systemization and a more widespread and congruent activity that seeps into different areas of Egyptian culture and religious activity. And um, one of these papyri that's been discovered is called the Book of Hours. This is one text I mentioned earlier on, which is also kind of conflated with these books of the sky. And this is essentially a collection of hymns and prayers which were to be recited to a whole variety of Egyptian deities upon the rotation of the celestial sphere. As new hours of the day passed, there were new prayers that were to be said, and I think this was actually maybe in hieratic, but this was also very much focused on the deity of Sokar, who was a late Memphite hybrid deity of Osiris and the other demiurgic god Ptah, who basically they all kind of ruled the afterlife, and they ruled over the workers of the necropolis, and Essentially, this was the central figure of this text. And we also have some interesting things about their astrological practice. There's so much to say about everything that was going on in these temples in an astrological context. But Winkler, in his amazing paper Stellar Scientists, actually translated this piece from some Demotic fragments, where it essentially sounds like the priests that are getting instructed in teaching astrology or practicing astrology in the temple had to keep their methods secret, and that actually they couldn't openly share the way they were doing calculations. So this text says, when you write and arrange your astrological board and your calculations, do not allow the young boy to discover your calculations. And so this is really interesting to kind of think about how, yeah, this was really the sacred science for these Egyptian people, and it couldn't be known either by potentially lower ranking priests or people who were essentially entering this temple hierarchy of priesthoods, which Clark talks about. There's a whole journey of evolving as an Egyptian priest, or if it was simply about people that came to have an astrological consultation, that most of the consultation would happen outside, and all of the calculations and technique work would happen somewhere secret inside where that wouldn't be shared, and then there would just be the delivery of the prognostications to the client or whoever is there outside. Another really amazing thing that's going on around this time is the lunar days. So this also had an earlier root in the tradition, but there were names for the 30 days of the lunar cycle. They each had a sort of symbolic meaning, and many of them had a deity associated with them, and also many of them had festivals that were celebrated on them. If you remember back to one of the inscriptions in the pyramid text for one of the princesses, there was a new month feast. There was a half new month feast. There was the full moon feast, right? So there were all these different lunar rituals that were kind of celebrated around the different parts of the month. One of the important ones happened on the new moon of Epiphi, which is one of the months in their civil calendar, where there was this holy marriage of Horus and Hathor, who were the local cult deities of the temples at Dendera and Edfu. And basically what would happen here is this divine statue of Hathor was brought up the Nile River on a boat, and she was sent off so that she would arrive in Edfu exactly on the new moon. And what's basically happening is there's this marriage of these deities, and it's celebrated until the full moon. And yeah, there's this really there's many different rituals and festivals that are sprouting up in this period that all have very intricate astrological correlations, and that involve a lot of astrological planning in terms of the mechanism of sending this thing up the river and having everyone ready to do this for 2 weeks, etc. So yeah, again, this is another piece of all of the lunar festivals that these temples are hosting for the people all over Egypt. Now, again, this is the whole Demotic renaissance of astrology, which is there's a lot of really exciting things happening here. So I'm going to just number off kind of quickly some awesome developments that were happening in these Demotic astrological manuals, many of which still have not even been translated. Now, Winkler in his paper, Some Astrologers and Their Handbooks in Demotic Egyptian, which was published in 2016, describes two different kinds of manuals. So they were written in Demotic and some of them in Greek, but these two different kinds were either universal or Sothic astrology, and then there was also natal astrology. And so they would basically use the positions of the planets in the 12 signs or within the 36 decans to either make annual mundane forecasts at the rise of Sothis, or for the delineation of a nativity for someone's own birth chart, excuse me. They were arranged in chapters based on the planets in the descending heptazone order. So it began with a chapter on Saturn. So for instance, in these natal astrological books, there would be a chapter for Saturn, and it basically would go through all of the 12 houses and for diurnal and nocturnal charts. There was also sometimes additional information about the moon being with any of these planets in the house. So we're already getting lots of manuals on different kinds of permutations of combinations for the planets. And there's also information in these early demotic materials on aspects on planetary sect, like diurnal and nocturnal sects of planets, benefics and malefic planets. There's also a lot of elements of involving the exaltations and depressions. And so there's even, I think Winkler cites some manuals have delineations for planets in the terms or bounds of other planets. So there's also been, this at some point along the way here, the creation and systemization of the system of Egyptian bounds, which is this kind of funky, irregular division of the signs that we can hypothesize goes back to these kind of mythical kings and priests, Nekepsu and Pedosiris, who wrote 15 books on astrology, which we'll get to in just a moment. And I know I'm trying to move a little quickly because I know we're already 90 minutes in. I started a little late, but I know I don't want to keep everyone here for too long, but I hope you guys are interested with some of the things I've been talking about here. And let me just check the chat really quickly if anyone's got questions. Oh, someone asked, what software do you use to track the heliacal phases of the stars? For that software, I have Placidus, which is a software developed by Rumen Kolev. That is, yeah, you can basically look at any of several different heliacal phases of fixed stars for different latitudes with different atmospheric extinctions. Yes, I would universally recommend that program for that kind of research. And let's see, there were also demotic almanacs here. So we basically got the first sets of ephemerides, which were there were annual, some were monthly, some were weekly, and they were basically just tracking the positions of the planets through the signs. There was a famous text published by Otto Neugebauer called Egyptian Planetary Texts, which was his translation of these demotic Stobart tables, which were these big almanacs that had positions for the planets from something like 15 BC to like 10 AD or something like 25 years of these ephemerides in Demotic. And of course, we have several horoscopes in Demotic, and this is again speaking to this whole rise of natal astrology that's begun by this point. And there was some initial work in translating these demotic horoscopes back in the mid 20th century by Neugebauer and also Spielberg. And recently, there were also some demotic horoscopes that came up, I think, 2 years or so ago by a scholar named Marina Escolano Poveda. She published these horoscopes that really shook up the way we understood demotic astrology to have been practiced at this time, because the horoscopes that Neugebauer published were dated pretty much mostly to the 1st century CE. But the ones she had published a couple of years ago were, I believe most of them were from about 50 years earlier, like some range of, let's say, 50 to 25 BC. And to not get too crazy into it, they had some totally other conceptions of house topics and house systems and the way those were kind of treated like astrological lots. There was also some confusion, though, on within her own research that was then reviewed by some other scholars. I think namely Andreas Winkler, who I've mentioned multiple times, wrote a review of her paper and brought up some of those things. So I mention it because there were some strange things going on that were present in these earlier demotic horoscopes that were, only, let's say, 200 years before, Valens was out there. And by that point, we had a very systemized use of the 12 topic house system, or the dodecatropos. But not too much before that. There was a lot of, there were some really interesting other things going on. Now we also have, in another kind of parallel lens, demotic magical texts, which is a whole other realm of demotic research and demoticism. There's maybe some of you have heard of course, the Greek magical papyri. There's also a catalog called the GEMF, which is the Greek and Egyptian magical formularies. And I have some notes on those. I'll read some of them quickly here, because essentially, they had all kinds of, when we talk about like Egyptian astrological magic, obviously my thesis from the beginning is that it's in many ways been incorporated into their rituals and spells, but we have some really explicit examples here. These are all written in Demotic Egyptian, and these are from GEM F16, which is also known as the Demotic Magical Papyrus of London and Leiden, which is sort of this infamous text. But these are from Thebes and around the 2nd century CE. This first one is called A Formula for the Security of Shadows, and it's essentially an invocation of Ursa Major. So I'll just read the translation. It says, stand and you should stamp on the ground with your foot 7 times, and you should recite these formulas to the foreleg, you having turned towards the north. 7 times, turn yourself away from the constellation and go to a dark room. And then there's some break-offs in the papyrus. Another formula to cause a woman to love a man. It's giving a list of ingredients first. Juice of the balsam tree, malabathrin, cushat plant oil, scented ... something. True oil, 2 luck measures. You should grind these. You should put them in a pure vessel, and you should put the oil above them as in this man and woman, maybe in their household or something. You should put the oil above them 1 day before the lunar month. When the lunar month occurs, you should bring back a kesh fish measuring 9 fingers in length. You should put this above the mentioned oil for 2 days. And it goes on to give a sequence of rituals to perform until the full moon, each for 2 or 3 days at each stage of the lunar cycle. And again, this was a formula for causing a love relationship between a woman and man. This next one is an amulet for the foot of a gouty man. Gout is this kind of ancient term for this disease of the foot, or it could be anywhere in the body. But it says, another amulet for the foot of a gouty man. You should write these names on a strip of silver or tin. You should put it on the skin of a deer. You should bind it to the foot of the man named with the 2 feet. And then there's all these kind of magical words and barbarous vowels and consonants and things, which I won't read because I don't know if I want to invoke that, but whatever. And then it says, may the person of the name who's getting their foot healed, may this person cease from every pain which is in his knees and in his feet. You do it while the moon is in Leo. Okay, so here were 3 just different examples of texts that involved praying directly to the stars, praying for a ritual that was coincident with the lunar cycle, or there were also, in the 3rd example, with the moon being in a specific image. There were also, we basically have all different kinds of spells that have to do with timing at sunrise or sunset or moonrise or a waxing or waning moon or a dark or full moon or the moon in front of certain celestial images. I think there's even this like protection talisman for like to do while Gemini, the twins are rising on the horizon. So there's dream sending spells to Toth under a full moon. Like there's really so many interesting things. And again, this whole world of demotic magical texts is this whole other field of research that's going on here. So that brings us to talking a little bit about the Hermetic astrology component here with Nekepso and Petosiris. And like I said, there are these mythical figures that are cited in almost all of the later Hellenistic authors, many of which probably are preserving fragments from them, notably Valens, who does it explicitly in many cases, but also authors like Firmicus Maternus and Hephaestion of Thebes, who are probably transmitting much of that material without explicitly saying it. Now, Valens often cites them and claims they wrote in this difficult to understand manner, for initiates, and it was all complicated and convoluted. But nevertheless, this was really crucial. This was like the beginning point, and scholars are dating these texts to have been written anywhere from the latest around the 1st century BC to as early as around the 7th century BC. So around like 600s. And that's because some people are proposing, namely the scholar, last name is Ryholt, He's conjectured King Nekepso was Necho the second of the 26th dynasty. So we're looking at a range somewhere in there. At the very least, there are these demotic materials from anywhere from 200 BC to 100 or later AD that are including these things, like I was saying, about bounds and about exaltations and sect and aspects and all of these things that we consider as a systemized version of astrology. Um, Now, Nekepso and Petosiris on their own have also been attributed as the inventors or transmitters of this sacred astrology. So, Diodorus Siculus, who was an author, basically cited them as having invented this divine art. And so he says and of course, Valens says, and we know from what Valens says directly about what he's telling us, directly citing them. We have several excerpts from them that they essentially brought to the stage bounds, all kinds of timing mechanisms like planetary periods and the ascensional times and all of the length of life topics, relating to circumambulation and monthly perfections and all these kinds of things. And someplace or another, Valens cites them for having brought many of these topics into the astrological canon. Firmicus says that they were given the revelation of the Thema Mundi as well, and along with several very secret doctrines of this decanic medical astrology based on the spiritual powers of the decans and the bright and full degrees. And these are things, again, I'm going to be talking about on February 11th. So if you're curious to hear about more of that stuff in this transmission of the decans from the Nekepso and Petosiris to more Hellenistic authors, I'm going to talk about all of that. And now, one last kind of concurrent thing here with the discussion of these Egyptian astronomical texts is this very mysterious reference of these books called the Salmes Keniaka, something like that. Now, they're cited only 3 or 4 times in like all of history, but they were supposedly 4 books on Egyptian astrology that likely came after Nekepso and Petosiris that contained a very powerful system of decanic astrology that also had things about the planets, the signs, about horoscopes, and they were even said, I think, Iamblichus has a quote where he's saying, "There's so much, and it's only a piece of the entire Hermetic system." Now, again, this is something we'll talk about in February 11th because Hephaestio gives us a really explicit and interesting quote from these books, which we can't find anywhere, where it's basically something along the lines of a decanic house system, where the topics of life, instead of being divided into 12, are actually divided into 36 different segments that each have their own topics. Unfortunately, we don't have surviving all of the decanic sectors as they are counted from the ascendant and each one's topic, but we have several of them. So that's a whole other area for research, which again is something I'll mention then. But yeah, these Salmes Keniaka, these texts have been really interesting to scholars from Egyptology and Assyriology because of the etymology of the name and the theory that some of these things came from Babylon. Of course, naturally, it's an interest to Hermeticists and scholars of ancient astrology. So yeah, lots of mysteries here. Now, when we talk about these temple texts, that these books, either the texts of Nekepso and Petosiris or the Salmes Keniaka were a part of, we also have to talk about the whole process of scribal initiation in these temples, which was no little deal here. Becoming an initiate of Thoth or becoming a scribal priest was a really significant endeavor. And, people, of course, many of you may be familiar with the texts referred to as the Corpus Hermeticum or the Book of Hermetic Philosophy, the precursor to that, because a lot of that was actually anywhere from like year 0 to 300 AD, that those texts of the Corpus Hermeticum, it was essentially Egyptian philosophy that made its way to Greece and was written in ancient Greek. The original philosophy was something called the Book of Thoth, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. This was the real Book of Thoth, though. This was written in Demotic and is one of the most confusing texts that's maybe ever been researched in the history of Egyptology. Not only because the Demotic is very difficult to even decipher, but also because it's so mystical in its own nature that it's very difficult to grasp what they're talking about. Um, now, Clement of Alexandria, who was he was a much later author. He talked about these books of Thoth, um, which included the initiation text of the Book of Thoth, which is the one I mentioned, but also to the whole corpus of books. And he said that he was in Egypt and observed a procession of Egyptian priests with all of their books, and it gave us a lot of information about these classes of priests and what books they had. So and I quote here from these 42 books of Thoth. He says, for first advances in this procession of priests, for first advances the singer, bearing some of the symbols of music. For they say that he must learn the two books of Hermes, the one of which contains the hymns of the gods, the second the regulations for the king's life. After the singer advances the astrologer, with the horologe in his hand and a palm, the symbols of astrology. He must have the astrological books of Hermes, which are four in number, always in his mouth. Of these, one is about the order of the fixed stars that are visible, another about the conjunctions and luminous appearances of the sun and moon, and the rest about the risings and settings of fixed stars. There was also some conflating evidence that perhaps there was a third book just on the rising of the fixed stars, and the fourth was just on ascensional times. But this is a little bit unclear. Now, I have one passage that I also just wanted to read from this so-called Book of Thoth. This was translated recently in the last 10 years. A second edition came out in 2021. And there's just this one passage that I thought was really beautiful. It says, and he understands the difficult passages, referring to the initiate here. And he elucidates the hieroglyphic signs, and he becomes an apprentice of the majesty of Thoth. And so essentially, these scribes are studying the Egyptian language in extreme detail and how each of these hieroglyphs actually has a whole mystical story behind it and what it represents spiritually. And these 42 birds or deific bird creatures, which if you've studied hieroglyphs, many of the symbols are different kinds of birds, and they're listed in 42. And Clement also just told us there were 42 books altogether. And we also know there were 42 nomes of Egypt, which were these different like cities essentially that had a different main cult center. There were also 42 deities and that watched over the weighing of the heart, that listened to the negative confession of the person who was having their heart weighed in the Hall of Two Truths, where they were basically getting justified and saying, I didn't do this, I didn't do this, I was moral, I didn't lie, I didn't steal, I didn't cheat. There's 42 things they say. So this magical number 42 is showing up all over this really early strata of Egyptian mysticism. And it's very interesting because we also know, if you've ever maybe heard of or encountered this book that was written recently. It's kind of cynical, but it's called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe. And apparently in it, I haven't really read it, but this guy popularized this thing of like, what's the mystery of the universe or what's the meaning of life? And the answer is like 42. And I always just thought that was funny because actually maybe he just said that coincidentally, maybe he knew something, but in Egypt, this whole 42 business was a big deal. So I finally have a final stage for us in our journey tonight, which is what more for us? What does this mean? What have we learned from all of this? What can we take from some of this? Um, and I want to propose something that is just of my own thinking about all of these things and why it could be helpful to any of us now that are practicing astrology. And before I get to the next slide, I'm going to read one quote from Iamblichus on the Ka and the Ba, which again represent the immortal soul and the sort of personality spirit of the person. And this is Iamblichus writing in On the Mysteries to basically he's elaborating on these two souls. He says, you say therefore that according to many of the Egyptians, that which is in our power depends on the motion of the stars. What the truth, however, is, respecting this, is necessary to unfold to you from the Hermetic conceptions of men, as these writings say, has two souls. So he first responds saying, you think that everything is just fate. But Iamblichus is saying, if you're really studying the Egyptian texts, they believe actually there are two souls, and that is namely the Ka and Ba. And one indeed is derived from the first intelligible and participates of the power of the demiurge, but the other is imported from the circulation of the celestial bodies, to which the soul that sees God returns. And so he's talking about the reunification of the Ka and Ba here. He's talking about the immortal, divine part of the soul with the mortal, earthly, personality-based, astrologically programmed human soul, so to say. Um, and in addition to this, um, there's some Hermetic fragments where Isis is talking to her son Osiris, and she's talking about the molding of souls into their bodies. And she's basically giving him these lessons on how reincarnation works. She's describing the levels of virtuous souls, these high planetary spheres, which Iamblichus says Hermes wrote like 100 books on the gods of the Empyrean sphere, 100 more books on the gods of the ethereal sphere, and 1,000 books on the gods of the celestial sphere. And she's describing what these higher zones are and how essentially royal souls are incarnated from these um, higher spheres, and lesser virtuous souls come from a lower sphere. And there's this force, which she's calling experience, and experience manages the kind of body that is allotted to each soul. And she says, she grants a body fitting to each soul. So this is essentially telling us that based off of the Ba of the person, the Ka, the body is assigned into a particular vessel. And this is interesting because when we talk about how our astrological models, a couple concurrently and maybe with Nekepso and Perisiris, who had these original definitions of length of life and measuring life force and life expectancy and the nativity, there is this inherent Egyptian philosophy that's weaved into that. And it has to do with these planets that are in charge of ruling our life force and our personality in the chart as they were conceived by the early Hellenistic astrologers as the controller or the predominator or the planet that is the host and source of the vital life force, which is the Ba. And then there is the planet that is responsible for ruling this planet, for giving it its years, its life, its character and personality, which is the Ka. And so my proposition here is that we have this controller, the vital life force. And I'm so sorry, actually, I'm just realizing that those terms are switched in this. So if you're seeing that, I am very sorry, but reverse those in your mind. The controller is our Ba, it's the life force, it's the ineffable, immortal substance of our soul. And this is ideally the sun or moon, because it's the luminary that gives us light and gives us breath and gives us illuminated existence in our body. And then we have a planet that was called the master or the oikodespotes, which is essentially the personality complex. And this is the planet who's encapsulating and ruling this life force based off of the rulership that is determined over the sun or moon. So originally, they were looking to the bound lord of the sun or moon. And that's why in many of the ancient texts, the sun or moon is not defined as being the master or the ruler of the life force, because they're just responsible for holding it, whereas the other five visible planets were responsible for molding it, shaping it, and determining its length or course of life. And lastly, we have the ascendant, which, this is the Ket, essentially. It's our physical body that the Isis describes as experience is allotting to us based off of our soul's quality. So if we are an active moral soul, she says it basically grants us an active physical body. If there's a sluggish soul, they're given a sluggish body. And she's even referring to animals here. It's a very complex philosophy. It's very interesting. If any of you can get your hands on this book called Hermetica 2, it was essentially all the rest of the Stobaean Hermetic fragments that were translated by this author named Litva in 2022. I highly recommend that text. And so my proposition here, my only like kind of like, well, what can this mean for us is we have a way to assess these two parts of our own self in the chart through the Ka and the Ba. That's namely through the sun or moon, which predominates our life force, and the ruling planet, which gives us the personality. So our simplified procedure for figuring out who these planets are is to first of all determine the sect. Okay, there's many rules on how this was done. There's many variations on how this was done. I think some of you actually might be familiar with these concepts, but if you're not, this is a very simplified procedure for how you could go about doing it, and then I'll explain why we should do this or what it would mean. The first step is to determine the sect of the chart. So very simply, if it's a day or night chart. And based off of that fact, we look to either the sun, if it's a day chart, or the moon, if it's a night chart. And we say that the Ba should reside in the sun or the moon. So this immortal spiritual complex should reside with one of those luminaries, whether we were born at day or night. The next step and last step is to determine the domicile lord or the bound lord, if you know what that is. But I was trying to just keep it simple. The ruler of that planet, the light of time, or the ruler of the sect of the chart, okay, the sun or moon. And again, the Ka and Ba are switched here, but the Ba is the luminary. The Ka is one of the other five planets that gives it that juicy personality. So identify those two planets. Is it a sun or moon? And then which planet is ruling that based off of if you're sun or moon? And then now we kind of have a model to think about how the Egyptians based their, this philosophy off of this reunification of these two forces one day. So if it should in some or any way be helpful for anyone to consider what those two planets look like they're doing in your chart, how they're interacting, what story or message they have for each other. This could open up a meditation or a dialogue for other practitioners to think about on another metaphysical level, what it means for us as those two really central parts of our soul, and how it could actually aid or, again, be of some meditative or contemplative assistance or insight for anyone who's curious to kind of adopt or integrate the Egyptian metaphysical context of this system and why it may be useful for us as modern practitioners of astrology. So with that, I thank you all for being here. I'm going to stop my screen share and come back to all of you lovely people who I can finally look at again. Yeah, that was it. So it was a little under 2 hours. So thank you to everyone that is still here and listening. Um, I've really been looking forward to sharing this, and I hope that you guys all enjoyed it as well. If you have any questions now, please feel free to unmute yourself, say hi, write something in the chat. I will stay as long as anyone has some questions about this material. I'll go back and just start with anything in the chat. So, Gray asked, what time period in the Roman era did the Sothic cycle realign? And is there documentation of Hellenistic astrologers being aware of this? This is a great question. Yes, there is. Unfortunately, I can't remember the year nor the emperor that like celebrated this, the Roman emperor that celebrated the fact that it happened a third time, but it was commemorated on coins, and that's one of the reasons they were able to date it and verify it was at that time because they made special coins to essentially commemorate that it had realigned for a third time. I am not aware of Hellenistic astrologers that have made any commentary on that realignment. Thank you for your question, Gray. C asked, what if they're the same? Sun, Leo sun in a day chart. In that case, I would look to the bound lord of the sun. So the Egyptian bound ruler of the sun, based off of the degree the sun is in within the sign of Leo, there will be one planet that is allotted the specific bound rulership of your sun at that degree. So I would look to that planet next. And in general, I would look to that planet before the domicile lord, just for general purposes and how I would do it actually. NM said, love this. I go over the Epicratetor, Despotes, Curios, plus domicile lords of Ascendant and Fortune in every reading. yeah, so critical and putting everything in perspective with the timing and someone's chart and life unfolding. Absolutely. They all work together as this beautiful integrated system. And yeah, I just wanted to share this perspective because yeah, in any way, for what it's worth, it's a model. It's just a model to approach what this ancient philosophy could mean for us. So I hope anyone um enjoyed that. I'm seeing so many of your wonderful comments. Thank you all for being here. Um, Tamron asks, what of these available translated texts, if any, would you refer to for stellar amulet making? Are we only looking to heliacal achronical rising? Does it get a little more ecliptic based at some point before what the Agrippa pulls from? Moon on the star on the MC. This is a great question because, as far as I'm concerned, the early Demotic magical material doesn't say anything about any kind of ecliptical projections for fixed stars. It's all about stars being exactly along the horizon or exactly on the meridian, which is important again. And this ties me back into my spiel I was saying at the beginning about astronomy, because the ascendant and the midheaven are just points. They are not astronomical realities for objects off of the ecliptic, which is like all of the fixed stars. So, in my mind, and as far as I'm aware, reading through these texts, it's either all about timing the alignment of planets or fixed stars on one of those great circles, or, like you mentioned, stars in the heliacal phase. Now, I'll just say personally, anecdotally, um, for myself and other awesome practitioners that I've had conversations with, that's an amazing way to connect spiritually with the energy of a fixed star for prayers, invocations, or talismans. So I would just thumb that up anyway, even though I haven't seen an ancient source for doing that, besides the fact that we know that while these stars were in their heliacal rising phases, especially in Egypt, of course they were making kinds of prayers and invocations as the calendar year went on. So not saying it's not like textually supported and isn't relevant, and I just think it's cool. It definitely has this powerful egregore that specifically in Egypt, there was of course a tradition for. So does that answer your question? Okay, awesome. Thanks, Tim. Um, Brian is asking this incredible, or let me see. Yes, yes, spent awesome time studying stuff here. Yes, absolutely. You're so welcome. I'm so glad you guys enjoyed this. Um, yeah, if people have any other questions, again, you can feel free to throw them in the comments or open up your mic. I'm happy to chat. Um, yeah. So, in that case, if not, I will wish you all an amazing night. Again, thank you so much for being here. Um, I hope you guys, if some of you are interested to, yeah, if you want to learn more about the Decans, especially on February 11th, please feel free to stop by. It's going to be a really interesting presentation, and it'll be a little bit more on practical astrological techniques as well. So, yeah, thank you guys. I wish you all the best. And I hope this is inspiring more conversation about Egyptian astrology. So, thank you all. And yeah, be well, everybody. Take care of yourselves.